Would you believe me if I told you that inside your very cells, there lies the memory of a ghost species that vanished 40,000 years ago? It is a staggering reality. Merely 2% of your genetic code is not modern human. We didn't simply replace the Neanderthals in a violent wave of conquest, as the old textbooks suggested. We merged. But within that prehistoric union lies a haunting truth about the women of their kind. A truth that science has only recently been brave enough to uncover. Imagine a world gripped by the bone-chilling winds of the Ice Age. In this brutal landscape, the women were not hiding in the shadows of caves. Aura stands before a massive bison, a heavy, stone-tipped spear gripped in her calloused hands. She is not fragile. The healed fractures on her skull and neck tell a story of high-stakes survival. These injuries match those of modern rodeo riders, proving that Neanderthal women were frontline warriors in the struggle for calories and life. For 300,000 years, they were the undisputed masters of Europe. They buried their dead with care, adorned themselves with eagle feathers, and etched mysterious symbols into stone. They were far from the brutish cavemen of popular imagination. They were something far more sophisticated. So why did they vanish? The answer isn't found in a great battle or a sudden plague, but in the quiet, unsettling social architecture that governed the lives of their women. In today's journey, we aren't just looking at Neanderthals as a category. We are looking at the specific, lived experience of the women. Ancient DNA research from the last decade has pulled back the curtain on a story of forced displacement, extreme isolation, and a slow demographic unraveling. By the end of this, you will never look at our ancient cousins the same way again. Let's descend into the frozen past. For a long time, we projected our own modern biases onto the Stone Age. Men hunted, women gathered. But the bones of women like Aura tell a vastly different tale. Bioarchaeologists have found muscle attachment points on female Neanderthal skeletons that rival those of today's elite male athletes. Their frames were engineered for raw, physical endurance. Their lives were not lived on the sidelines. Their bodies were shaped by the direct violence of the Ice Age landscape. The distribution of injuries is perhaps the most revealing clue. We see a concentration of head and upper body trauma in female remains. This suggests they weren't throwing spears from a distance. They were engaging in confrontation hunting, getting close enough to a thrashing beast to feel its breath. This physical reality challenges every comfortable assumption we've made about gender roles in deep history. In Aura's world, survival didn't care about gender. It only cared about strength. Yet physical power has its limits. While bones tell us about the body's struggle, they cannot tell us how a society is organized. They cannot tell us where a person came from or who they loved. For that, we needed the blueprints of life, their DNA. And when scientists finally extracted it from a remote corner of Siberia, the image that emerged was not one of a thriving empire, but of a species standing precariously on the edge of a cliff. Deep in the Altai Mountains sits Chagarskaya Cave. A few years ago, researchers recovered the remains of 13 individuals here. This wasn't a collection of bones washed in over thousands of years. These people lived together, at the same time. It was a family. For the first time, we weren't looking at a species in the abstract. We were looking at a community. And it was within this small group that the disturbing reality of Neanderthal womanhood was finally quantified. When the genetic data from Chagarskaya was processed, the first thing that struck the team was a terrifying absence of diversity. In any healthy population, genetic variation is the shield against disease and extinction. But here, the effective population size was estimated at just 10 to 20 individuals. Think about that. an entire social world, an entire breeding pool consisting of fewer people than you'd find in a modern elevator. They were living in total genetic isolation. But the real shock came when they separated the male and female lineages. By looking at the Y chromosome, which passes from father to son, they found that the men were all closely related. They had stayed in that cave, in that valley, for generations. The fathers, sons, and grandfathers were a static line. However, when they looked at the mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child, the story flipped. The women were genetically diverse. They didn't belong to the local gene pool in the same way the men did. The conclusion was undeniable. Neanderthal society practiced female-biased dispersal. When a young woman reached maturity, she was forced to leave her home, her mother, and everything she knew to be integrated into a distant group of strangers. Aura wasn't just a hunter. She was a traveler in a world where travel was a death sentence. This is a biological mechanism to prevent inbreeding, and we see it in chimpanzees and some modern human cultures. But in the context of the Ice Age, it takes on a darker tone. With groups so small and so far apart, these women weren't just moving to the next village. They were being displaced across hundreds of miles of frozen tundra. For a Neanderthal woman, leaving home meant a permanent severance from her past. Imagine the psychological toll of this displacement. Aura would have traveled through landscapes that had no names, moving toward a group of 10 people she had never met, knowing she would never see her birth family again. This was the social architecture of their species. It was a strategy for survival that, ironically, may have accelerated their end. When your entire regional population is scattered into tiny pockets of a dozen people, the system is incredibly fragile. This is where the story of Neanderthal women collides with our own. As Homo sapiens moved into Europe, they encountered these small, isolated groups. Because Neanderthal women were already the movers of their species, the ones accustomed to integrating into new tribes, they became the natural bridge between our two kinds. They were the ones who carried the genetic legacy of their people into ours. But there is a mathematical tragedy here. If a group of 12 Neanderthals loses 2 reproductive-age women, either to a modern human group or to the hazards of the journey, that group is effectively dead. They didn't have the margin to survive even minor losses. The Neanderthal extinction wasn't a single catastrophic event. It was a slow, quiet thinning out. The women were moving out, but there weren't enough coming back in to replace them. We often imagine the human versus Neanderthal conflict as a war, but the DNA suggests something more subtle and perhaps more haunting. It was a demographic absorption. We didn't necessarily kill them, we simply outnumbered them, and their own social structure, the constant moving of women between dwindling groups, made them vulnerable to being swallowed by the rising tide of modern humans. Consider the Vinja woman found in Croatia. Her genome showed signs of extreme long-term inbreeding, yet she lived to adulthood. This tells us 2 things. Her community was desperately lonely in a genetic sense, but they were also deeply compassionate. They cared for their sick and their weak, even when the biological odds were stacked against them. They were a people of immense heart, trapped in the world of shrinking numbers. Then there is the remarkable story of Denny, the 90,000-year-old girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. Her mother had traveled thousands of miles from Western Europe to the Altai Mountains. Think of the sheer courage of that journey. These women were the greatest explorers of the ancient world, not out of curiosity, but out of the biological necessity to keep their species' flame alive. The final blow for many of these groups came 39,000 years ago with the Campanian Ignimbrite eruption. It was the largest volcanic event in Europe for 200,000 years. Ash covered 3 continents, and a volcanic winter descended. For a population already teetering on the edge, already struggling with low genetic diversity and the loss of its women to dispersal, this wasn't just a weather event. It was a mathematical termination. In those final years, picture a woman like Aura. She is far from the place of her birth, raising a child in a world that is getting colder and quieter. She doesn't know she is one of the last of her kind. She only knows the cold, the hunt, and the small faces of her clan. She is a survivor, unaware that her lineage is about to transition from a living culture into a 2% fragment of someone else's DNA. The story of the Neanderthal woman is a powerful lesson in the cost of isolation. Strength and intelligence are not enough if a species is divided into islands. Their disappearance teaches us that our greatest survival tool as modern humans wasn't our spears or our brains. It was our ability to maintain massive, interconnected social networks. We survived because we stayed together. They faded because they were forced apart. Today, when you look in the mirror, remember that you are looking at a survivor of a different sort. Those fragments of Neanderthal DNA in you, the ones that help your immune system or affect your skin's response to sunlight, are the gifts of women who traveled through the ice to find a future. They didn't truly die. They changed. They gave up their species' identity so that a part of them could live on in us. Science is finally giving these women their story back. They weren't just cave women. They were the brave wanderers of a dying world, the primary hunters of the tundra, and the mothers of a hybrid humanity. They deserve to be remembered not for how they fell, but for the impossible distances they traveled to keep the human story going. Do you think that if the Neanderthals had stayed together in larger groups, they would still be walking among us today as a separate species? Or was our absorption of them an inevitable part of evolution? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective on this ancient mystery. And if you found this deep dive into our past fascinating, don't forget to subscribe for more.